He stood in the kitchen barefoot, still in yesterday's shirt, staring at the small stick in his hand like it had spoken. The windows behind him framed a city waking up, unaware that Kyle Donovan, the man headlines called unshakable, was shaking from the inside out. Two faint lines, two lines that whispered the truth louder than any boardroom argument or financial forecast ever had. He sat down slowly, setting the test on the marble counter like it might shatter. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a decade. Love, the kind that makes you kneel, the kind that changes everything. His throat tightened as he whispered to no one, "How did I get here?" Before we begin, if you believe love deserves a second chance, go ahead and like this video and subscribe. It helps us tell more stories like this. He once believed he would never love again. Not because he didn't want to, but because the weight of loving and losing had hollowed him out. His name was Kyle Donovan, 39 years old, CEO of one of the most powerful investment firms in New York. At least that's how the world knew him, through headlines, glossy magazine spreads, and Forbes profiles praising his ability to turn crumbling companies into gold. What they didn't know was that Kyle hadn't been alive since the day the music stopped. Let's start with the truth no one dared to ask him aloud. How does a man who has everything lose the only thing that matters? The answer is always the same. It happened too fast. Years ago, he sat behind the wheel with a violin case in the back seat, and a woman beside him whose laughter could make traffic feel like poetry. Her name was Mireille. She didn't wear designer dresses or chase limelight. She played music that could make grown men cry. She was his peace. Until the road turned, the tires lost grip, and peace was swallowed by silence. He hadn't touched a steering wheel since. Have you ever walked through life pretending everything was fine just to avoid admitting you were broken? Kyle mastered it, built an empire on it. To the outside world, he was composed, calculated, untouchable. But behind closed doors, his apartment was too quiet, his bed too cold. He kept her violin in a glass case he never opened, and sometimes at 3 a.m., he would sit in the hallway with his head in, his hands, because the memory of her voice was louder than anything on earth. He turned grief into numbers, emptiness into net worth. That's how he survived. No parties, no dating, no second chances. Love became something that belonged to other people. People with fewer scars. People who didn't close their eyes every night and replay the same memory until it left them gasping. But what if pain isn't the end? What if your soul knows a different story is waiting, if only you're brave enough to open the door? Kyle never planned to attend that charity dinner. His assistant had please replied without telling him, and he was too tired to argue. The room was all glassware and ambition, everyone pretending to care more than they did. He stood in the corner, sipping flat champagne, wishing he could disappear. That's when he noticed her, not because she was loud or flashy, but because she wasn't. She moved through the room like she wasn't trying to impress anyone. Simple navy dress, no makeup mask, and eyes that didn't scan for status. They searched for sincerity. Solena. She tilted her head when she looked at him, as if trying to figure out why he looked so uncomfortable in his own success. "You hate these things, don't you?" she'd said, soft-spoken but firm. Kyle blinked, thrown off by her directness. "I do," he replied, before he could guard himself. She grinned. "Thought so. Your shoulders are stiff, like your suit's choking you." No one had spoken to him like that in years, maybe ever. That night they didn't talk about money or mergers. They talked about why she taught art, why color mattered to children who'd only ever seen gray. She told him about her students who didn't have safe homes but found joy in a brushstroke. Kyle had built towers across continents, but he couldn't remember the last time someone made him feel. The conversations continued, over coffee in tiny cafes where no one recognized him, in parks where her laugh echoed through trees, on sidewalks at midnight where he told her stories he hadn't told anyone in 10 years. He told her about Mireille. He told her he didn't believe in fate anymore. Solène didn't try to fix him. She didn't speak in cliches or offer surface sympathy. She listened, and when she finally spoke, she said the words that changed everything. "Maybe fate isn't the one who needs to forgive you." He looked up, breath caught. "Maybe it's you." He'd carried guilt like a second skin, like penance, but she was the first person who saw him, not the mask. For the first time in a decade, he started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to walk through life like a ghost. Maybe the man who forgot how to feel still had a heart worth healing. Maybe love wasn't lost forever. Now, here he stood again, present day, holding proof that life hadn't just offered him healing. It had offered him legacy. His thumb brushed over the test on the counter. In the bedroom, Celine was still asleep, curled around a pillow with a small smile on her lips. The home they built was quiet, not from absence but peace. He whispered her name once under his breath, like a prayer. He never thought he'd find love again, but life had surprised him. And this time, he was ready to hold on, with both hands. The elevator opened to the top floor of a tower that bore his name. Kyle Donovan stepped into the glass-lined corridor of Donovan Ventures, where silence was protocol and reverence trailed behind every footstep. Assistants stood when he passed. Senior executives straightened their ties. No one dared speak unless spoken to. He was legend in that building. They whispered stories about the time he closed a $400 million acquisition in under an hour, about how he predicted market collapses before they happened, about his knack for turning failing businesses into overnight giants. But those stories never included how he took his coffee, or what made him laugh, or who he loved, because no one knew. The walls of Donovan Ventures were steel and frost, just like the man who built them. Kyle didn't care for small talk. Meetings started on time and ended before anyone got comfortable. He didn't linger at parties, never indulged in gossip, and turned down every tabloid interview that tried to spin his image into something digestible. To the world, he was successful, ruthlessly so. But what success rarely shows is its cost. His penthouse had the finest finishes. His wardrobe, tailored in Europe. His car collection, stored beneath a private garage with biometric access. He had wealth that spanned continents and influence that shook boardrooms. Yet he went home alone. Every night. He liked it that way. Or, so he told himself. Her name was spoken only in silence now. Mireille. He never deleted her number, never removed the photos tucked into the back of his drawer, but he hadn't said her name aloud in years. She had come into his life when he wasn't looking. Back then, he wasn't a tycoon, just a man with ambition and an overdrawn bank account. She played violin in cafes on the weekend and taught music to kids who couldn't afford private lessons. They met at a friend's rooftop birthday. She wore a thrifted denim jacket and brought lemon cookies she'd baked herself. She didn't know who he was, didn't care when she found out. She asked about his favorite sound, not his net worth. Kyle had never met someone who listened with her whole presence, who laughed with her eyes first, who didn't need to be impressed. She showed him a life outside numbers, slow Sundays, music in the kitchen, love notes on napkins, candles melted into empty wine bottles. He fell, hard, and it scared him how much he needed her. They'd been driving home from a weekend getaway. He remembered the conversation. She was teasing him about the way he folded laundry. Her hand was resting on his knee. She turned her head to laugh. The truck didn't stop in time. Kyle had braked, but it hadn't mattered. The glass shattered. The music stopped, and she never opened her eyes again. They said it wasn't his fault, that the road was wet, that the other driver had fallen asleep. But Kyle couldn't hear any of that. All he could hear was her laugh, cut off too soon. He walked away from that night with only a few cuts. She didn't. Grief didn't arrive like thunder. It crept in, slow and silent. Kyle stopped answering calls that weren't about business. He returned to work 3 days after her funeral, shutting the door to his office and the rest of the world. No condolences, no questions, just spreadsheets, deadlines, contracts. Numbers couldn't hurt him. Feelings could. He grew sharper, more precise. A machine, not a man. Gone were the photos on his desk, the vinyl records, the scent of her on his sweaters. He packed them away, out of sight, but never out of mind. Some nights he'd wake up convinced he heard her violin through the walls. He'd sit up, heart pounding, only to realize the silence was real, permanent. People began to describe him differently, not just brilliant, but distant, cold, unreachable. He was okay with that. He preferred it, because to open up again meant risking more pain, and pain had already taken too much. He built his days with precision. Wake at 5 a.m., gym, emails, meetings, lunch alone, calls, deals, dinner at his desk, a glass of scotch, lights off by 11. He didn't deviate, not even on weekends. There was no room for chaos, no room for softness. and certainly no room for love. Every year, on the anniversary, he disappeared. His staff knew not to schedule anything. No one knew where he went, only that he would return the next day quieter than usual, more withdrawn. But on those days, Cale would drive hours north, to a cemetery tucked between quiet trees. He never parked near the front. He always walked. Her name was etched into stone, simple, elegant, like she was. He never brought flowers. Mireille hated cut flowers, said they were beautiful and dying at the same time. So, he brought music. He'd set his phone next to her stone and press play on a recording she once sent. Her playing Bach, out of tune in the last bars because she was laughing. Then he would sit in the grass and listen until the battery ran out. No words, no tears, just silence. The ache never lessened. It settled in his bones like winter, and in that quiet, he'd remember what it meant to feel alive. But by the time he returned to Manhattan, he'd put the mask back on. Donovan, the tycoon, untouchable, efficient, alone. That's how he survived. But deep down, some small part of him whispered a question he was too afraid to answer. Was this living, or just existing? Have you ever shut out the world to avoid pain? Let me know in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. Kyle arrived late. He hadn't wanted to attend, but there were promises to keep. The event had been hosted by a non-profit his firm recently funded, and his signature alone had drawn press attention. He slipped through the side entrance, bypassing reporters and flashing cameras. He stood near the bar, scanning the room without really seeing anyone. Everyone was dressed to impress, flashy suits, practiced grins, and business cards passed like currency. Kyle adjusted his cufflinks, already regretting showing up. He barely spoke at these things anymore. Everyone wanted something. A photo, a pitch, access. He was considering an early exit when he noticed her, not because she demanded attention, but because she didn't. She moved differently, unbothered by the spotlight. Her dress was modest, neat, but not extravagant. Her posture open but not performative. She wasn't here to network. She wasn't here to charm. And when their eyes met, she didn't look away. She looked through. Kyle blinked. He wasn't used to that. She smiled, not coyly, not seductively, but as if she recognized something in him that others missed. "You look like you'd rather be anywhere else," she said, as she stepped closer, holding a drink he hadn't seen her get. Her voice was calm, confident, laced with curiosity. Kyle raised an eyebrow. That obvious? Only to someone who doesn't want to be here either. Her name was Solane. They talked, lightly at first, about how events like this always served bad wine and even worse music. But then she asked something no one ever had. What would you be doing right now if you didn't feel obligated to be here? Kyle stared at her. No one asked questions like that. Not anymore. Home, he said honestly. Reading, or maybe just quiet. She smiled again. That sounds like a much better use of time. The following week, he saw her again. She was running a youth workshop at an art center his firm had agreed to sponsor months earlier. The visit was meant to be a quick photo op, a handshake, a donation plaque. But Kyle stayed longer than planned. Solane was in the middle of teaching a group of children how to stretch a canvas. Paint speckled her fingertips. She was crouched beside a girl who couldn't have been more than 8, gently guiding her brush across a background of swirling color. Kyle stood in the back, unnoticed. She wasn't like anyone he'd met. Afterward, they shared coffee in a small cafe across the street. No assistants, no appointments, just the two of them. You're different outside of suits, she noted, sipping slowly. You're different outside of charity events. She shrugged. I don't go to many. I hate pretending to care about people's money. He looked at her, half smiling. So, why talk to me? She didn't answer right away. You looked sad. But not in the self-pity kind of way. More like someone who forgot what joy sounds like. He swallowed. Hard. I wasn't trying to diagnose you, she added, softer now. Just, sometimes sadness recognizes sadness. Kyle wasn't used to honesty being so gentle. He found himself saying things he hadn't meant to share, about sleepless nights, about how noise made him feel more alone, about how people expected too much and cared too little. Solane didn't interrupt. She didn't fill silences with nervous chatter or rush to offer advice. She just listened. By the time they finished their coffee, It was clear this wasn't a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something unfamiliar. They started seeing each other without calling it anything. A walk here, a late lunch there. Unscripted time, unhurried. Kyle didn't know what to make of it at first. There was no agenda with her, no transactional energy. She didn't ask about his firm. She didn't seem impressed or intimidated by who he was. She once teased him for checking his watch too often. "You act like minutes are currency," she laughed, nudging him. "Don't worry, you're not losing money talking to me." He chuckled, surprised at how natural it felt. Her sense of humor wasn't biting, it was disarming. Playful, but never at someone else's expense. They'd walk through Central Park on weekday afternoons, where Selene pointed out cloud shapes like a child and told stories about her students who painted sunsets with crayons because they couldn't afford real paint. Kyle listened, and somewhere between stories and sidewalk coffees, he started feeling again. It scared him. He tried to keep her at a distance, but Selene didn't push. She moved at her own pace and let him do the same. When he didn't reply to texts right away, she didn't guilt him. When he opened up suddenly, she didn't overreact. One night, they sat on a bench watching kids play soccer in a dimly lit park. Kyle asked, "Do you believe people ever really move on from grief?" Selene didn't answer right away. "I think people carry it," she said eventually. "But if they're lucky, they find someone who helps them carry it lighter." He turned his face away, but not fast enough to hide the way that landed. He hadn't felt seen like that in a long, long time. There was no moment when it became something real. It wasn't a grand gesture or a late-night confession. It was Kyle offering to help her carry supplies into her art studio after a long day. It was Selene handing him a scarf when he forgot his coat. It was a cup of chamomile tea left at his desk without a note. Quiet things, real things. She never asked about his past, not directly, but she gave him space to speak. And when he finally told her about Mireille, it wasn't rehearsed. It poured out on a Tuesday evening after a walk, sitting on a bench near the East River. His voice caught halfway through. He paused, expecting discomfort or polite sympathy. Instead, Selene placed her hand over his, not to stop him, just to say, "I'm here." He exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. That night, he didn't sleep alone. Not in the physical sense. Selene still went home. But something had shifted. His chest didn't feel as tight. His thoughts didn't race. She didn't try to fix him. She simply stayed. The world felt slightly less sharp. Kyle began to notice the difference in the smallest of things. He still woke up early, still opened his laptop before the city stirred, but now he brewed 2 cups of coffee instead of 1. Selene had a way of folding herself into his routines without disrupting them. She didn't push. She didn't invade. She simply existed nearby, with presence that felt grounding instead of overwhelming. Sometimes she'd read at his kitchen island while he reviewed contracts. Other times she'd sketch in silence, feet tucked beneath her on the couch, humming softly under her breath. He liked that she never asked for his attention. But she had it anyway. They hadn't defined what they were. Kyle didn't have the language for that yet, but he found himself drawn to her presence, the way sunlight creeps through blinds when you're not looking. He liked doing things for her. Quiet, domestic things. Fixing the wobbly leg on her kitchen stool, replacing the light bulb in her hallway without being asked, picking up her favorite mint tea when she ran out. She never made a list. He just remembered, and in return, she filled his world with little things he hadn't known he missed. A scarf draped over his shoulders before he left for work, warm soup waiting on the stove after long meetings, sticky notes left on his desk. "Breathe. You're allowed to be tired. Don't forget to look up." One night, after a long dinner of takeout and soft jazz, Kyle asked her, "Why do you do all this?" She looked at him like the answer should have been obvious. "Because that's what you do when you care." It took him a moment to respond, not because he didn't understand, but because he couldn't remember the last time someone cared like that. They were walking along the water one evening, coats pulled tight against, the late autumn chill, when Selene asked the question he always avoided. "Have you ever been in love before?" Kyle's steps slowed, his throat tightened. She didn't press him, just walked in silence beside him, giving him room. Finally, he spoke. Yes. The pause that followed wasn't empty, it was heavy with memories. Her name was Mireille. He hadn't said the name in years. It felt foreign on his tongue, but sacred. She played the violin. Taught kids, laughed with her whole face. Celine listened, head tilted slightly, eyes calm. She was light, he added, voice low. And I don't know what I was. But she made it all feel possible. Celine didn't interrupt. We were driving back from a trip. She was teasing me about my cooking. There was this truck. He swallowed. I was driving. The words hovered between them. Celine didn't flinch, didn't say it wasn't his fault, didn't rush to offer comfort. Instead, she let the silence settle like a soft blanket. You don't talk about her much, do you? She asked gently. Kyle shook his head. People are afraid of grief. They want to tidy it up, move past it. But I couldn't. He hesitated. I still hear her sometimes, in the quiet. Celine reached for his hand, held it without words. After a long pause, she whispered, maybe fate isn't the one who needs to forgive. Maybe it's you. The sentence landed deeper than she knew. He stared ahead, blinking against the wind. That night, Kyle sat awake for hours, the sound of her words echoing in a part of him he'd kept sealed for too long. A week later, Kyle stood in front of the grave he hadn't visited in nearly 10 years. He drove himself this time. No driver, no security detail, no schedule, just a single flower, fresh, wild, and imperfect. Mireille would have liked that. The path leading to her resting place was quiet, lined with yellow leaves and the kind of stillness he used to run from. He knelt beside the headstone, brushing off a few fallen twigs. Her name was still as clear as ever, though the edges of the stone had softened with time. For a long while, he didn't speak. Then, slowly, the words came. I met someone. His voice cracked. She's kind, different. He hesitated. She doesn't make me forget you. No one could. But she makes me want to remember the parts of me you loved. He looked down at the grass. I blamed myself for so long. I thought living again meant betraying you. He closed his eyes. But I think you'd want this. You'd want me to breathe again, laugh again. A breeze passed through the trees, lifting the leaves into a gentle rustle. I just wanted to say, thank you for loving me first. He stood slowly, brushing off his pants. His chest didn't feel hollow this time. It felt full, of ache, of gratitude, of something new. Kyle walked away without looking back, not because he was forgetting, but because he was finally ready to keep moving. In the weeks that followed, Kyle changed, but subtly. His staff noticed. He lingered longer after meetings, laughed more during lunches. He showed up to the office with paint on his sleeves one morning. No one dared ask why. He started sending anonymous donations to music schools, joined Celine during her workshops when he could. The children liked him, especially the quiet ones. He wasn't trying to be someone else. He was finally allowing himself to be whole. One evening, he and Celine sat on the floor of her apartment surrounded by half-finished canvases and mugs of tea. He watched her work, brush in hand, brow furrowed in focus, and felt something shift inside him again. Not panic, not fear, peace, a kind he hadn't known before. Do you ever think she'd be proud of you? Celine asked quietly. He looked up. I don't know, he admitted, but I think she'd be proud I let myself feel again. Celine smiled, setting her brush down. You didn't have to tell me about her, she said. I wanted to, he replied, because if I'm going to love you, it has to include everything that shaped me. She didn't move. He reached for her hand. I don't know what this becomes, he said honestly, but I want to find out. She leaned into him, head resting on his shoulder. In that stillness, he understood something important. Healing wasn't loud. It wasn't swift. It was slow, earned, built through presence, honesty, and the courage to begin again. If this part touched your heart, give this video a like and share it with someone who believes in healing. The morning started like most others. A quiet yawn, warm socks, the kettle hissing softly in the kitchen. Kyle was scrolling through his inbox when he heard Celine call his name, not with panic but with something unfamiliar in her voice. He walked to the bathroom doorway. She stood there, holding a small object in her hand. Her eyes were wide, her cheeks pale. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Kyle's gaze dropped to the test. 2 pink lines. He blinked. For a second, the air in the room shifted. Not heavy, not loud, just different. Everything slowed. Celine looked at him. I'm not sure how to feel. Are you okay? He asked softly. She nodded, then shook her head, then nodded again. I'm happy, but scared. He stepped forward, took the test from her, and set it gently on the counter. His arms wrapped around her instinctively. She leaned into him, breath shaky. We'll figure this out, he whispered. Together. She let out a quiet laugh against his chest. You don't even look surprised. I'm surprised, he said, but not in a bad way. Not overwhelmed? He kissed her forehead. Only by how much I care about you. Solène exhaled. That night, they didn't talk about baby names or logistics. They just lay in bed, hands clasped over the curve of her stomach, neither of them sleeping. Both of them wondering what the future would look like now that it had changed. The clinic smelled like lemon disinfectant and something else Kyle couldn't name, something sterile and waiting. He sat beside Solène in the dim ultrasound room, their fingers intertwined, his thumb brushing over the inside of her palm in quiet reassurance. The technician moved the wand across her belly, eyes focused on the screen. There they are, she said. Solène froze. The woman turned the monitor slightly. 2 flickering pulses appeared on the screen, quick, bright, unmistakable. Kyle leaned in, confused at first. Then his eyes widened. Solène gasped softly. Are you saying? Twins, the technician confirmed, smiling. Solène covered her mouth. Kyle stared at the screen for a full 5 seconds before a laugh escaped his lips, sudden, startled, full. He laughed harder than he had in years. Not a polite chuckle, not a businesslike exhale. A real laugh. Solène looked at him, her own laughter bubbling up through her nerves. You're laughing? He nodded, tears at the corners of his eyes. It's ridiculous. It's terrifying. It's perfect. In the parking lot afterward, they sat in the car with the printed ultrasound between them. Kyle looked at the grainy photo like it held some secret language only they could read. He turned to her. This feels like life catching up to me. Solène smiled. Like it waited until you were ready. He placed his hand gently on her stomach. I don't know what I'm doing, he admitted. Neither do I, she replied. They kissed like they were writing a vow, unspoken but certain. They decided not to hire designers. Solène wanted to paint the nursery herself. She said it helped her feel connected, like each brushstroke made it more real. Kyle cleared his schedule on weekends and rolled up his sleeves. For someone used to signing billion-dollar deals, he had a surprisingly steady hand with a paint roller. They chose a soft blue for the ceiling, then added gentle clouds that swirled like whispers. Solène insisted on painting tiny stars in the corners. Kyle added a sun behind the door, saying every day should start with light. The room came together slowly. A wooden crib, a rocking chair Solène found second-hand and restored. Shelves Kyle built himself, though he insisted they might not pass inspection. One afternoon, Kyle caught Solène humming while folding tiny onesies. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, just watching. She turned. What? He shook his head. Nothing, just... You. She walked over, looped her arms around his neck. You're allowed to be happy, you know, she said quietly. I am, he replied. I just forget sometimes. She nodded. So let me remind you. They danced slowly in the middle of the unfinished nursery, her head resting. Against his chest, the walls around them glowing with soft, fresh color. It was in that room, surrounded by things that hadn't existed a month ago, that Kyle realized something profound. Love didn't always arrive in fireworks. Sometimes it arrived like paint drying on a wall you built together, quiet, steady, and true. Kyle's days began to change. He still ran the company, but something was different. He paused longer in the mornings, listened more during meetings, laughed more easily with his team. His board noticed the shift. So did his staff. He still closed deals, but now he made time to eat lunch with Solène in the park. He'd answer emails while she sketched beside him. Sometimes they just sat without speaking, comfortable in the quiet they used to fear. Solène's belly began to show. Strangers smiled at her on the street. Kyle noticed how often she touched her stomach now, absently, protectively. They attended prenatal classes, laughing at their awkward attempts to swaddle dolls and breathe on cue. Kyle was terrible at it. Solène teased him, and he didn't mind. Every night, he read to her belly. Children's books, poetry, even an economic theory chapter once, which earned him a pillow to the chest. One evening, as they watched a documentary about endangered birds, Solène rested her head on his shoulder. Do you think you'll be a good father? She asked, Not accusing, just curious. Kyle was quiet. "I don't know," he said finally, "but I know I'll try." She looked up. "That's enough." He reached for her hand and kissed it. "This isn't what I imagined for my life," he whispered. She smiled. "Me neither." And yet there they were, two people who had once lived like ghosts, now preparing for two new lives. It started with one photo. Kyle and Selene leaving a restaurant. He was helping her into a car. She was laughing at something he'd said. By morning, the image was on the front page of half a dozen celebrity sites. Who is she? Billionaire bachelor off the market? Meet the mystery woman melting Wall Street's Iceman. The real problem wasn't the photo. It was the story they invented around it. They called her a social climber, a charity worker with a past. Some headlines suggested Kyle had been manipulated. Others claimed she was hiding something. Selene wasn't prepared. Neither was Kyle. The morning after the story broke, Selene opened her inbox to find it flooded. Journalists digging, strangers speculating, former acquaintances from her childhood reaching out, looking for their moment in the light. Kyle offered to shut it all down. Legal teams, cease and desist letters, press statements. But Selene said, "No. If we respond, we give it power," she said quietly. "Let it burn out on its own." Still, the pressure grew. Paparazzi outside their apartment, reporters calling her work. One tabloid ran a story about her students, twisting the facts until even the truth sounded suspicious. Kyle tightened security, but what hurt most wasn't the noise. It was watching Selene pretend it didn't hurt. Kyle knew where the next blow would come from. Darren Vale, once his closest business partner, now a man with a grudge sharpened over years of envy. Darren had stayed silent through Kyle's quiet transformation. He tolerated the schedule changes, the new foundation donations, even the softening of Kyle's public tone. But the baby news? The move to part-time leadership? That was a threat. He called a surprise board meeting under the guise of protecting shareholder interests. Behind the closed doors, he laid it out. Kyle's distracted. His judgment is compromised. His focus is elsewhere. Kyle listened in silence. They presented numbers, missed meetings, PR fallout, stock fluctuations that had nothing to do with him, twisted into a narrative of instability. He could have fought back, easily, with proof, with records, with leverage, but he didn't. Instead, he stood and looked around the table at men who once praised him for his precision and fearlessness. "I gave this company everything for almost 2 decades, he said calmly. "Built it, defended it, carried it when no one else would. And now that I've chosen to build something else, something lasting, you call it weakness." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "This isn't about business. It's about power. And I finally learned that power isn't the same as peace." The room was quiet. He didn't wait for a vote. He walked out. Back home, Selene was waiting on the couch, legs curled under her, reading a children's book out loud to their growing twins. He sat beside her, resting his head on her shoulder. "I walked away." She closed the book. "Good," she whispered. Selene never asked Kyle to choose. She didn't need him to quit his career, to change for her, to prove anything. But when the world turned cruel, she didn't shrink. She showed him what grace under fire looked like. One afternoon, a reporter cornered her outside the community center. Threw invasive questions in her face about her past, about the babies, about Gail. Selene looked him straight in the eye and said, "You're not here for truth. You're here for spectacle. But I won't give you either." She walked away without raising her voice, without trembling. That night, Kyle told her, "I've handled billion-dollar deals and global disputes. But watching you say that, that was the most powerful thing I've ever seen." She smiled softly. "You taught me how to protect what matters. I'm just applying the lesson." They began to make decisions together, not out of fear, but out of vision. They sold the penthouse, left behind the noise and the security gates and the endless elevator rides, moved to a quiet stretch of land in upstate New York where the neighbors waved and no one cared about their names. Kyle began working as a consultant, choosing the projects he believed in. Selene began teaching art in a local elementary school where her students didn't care about her last name, only that she brought extra brushes and stayed late. Their home was smaller, warmer, quieter, and at night they listened to the wind through the trees and felt no need to say much. Selene was in the kitchen, peeling apples for a pie recipe she found on a crumpled index card tucked inside a used cookbook. Kyle walked in, sleeves rolled, a folded letter in hand. "It's from the firm," he said. "They want to renegotiate. Try to keep me on full time. Darren's gone." Selene looked up, waiting. "I could go back," Kyle said, setting the letter down. "You could." He leaned on the counter. "But I won't." She smiled faintly. "Why not?" He looked around. The soft music playing. The open window. The sound of birds instead of traffic. "Because this is what I built too," he said. "And it finally feels like something worth protecting." They ate dinner on the back porch that evening. No media, no investors, no performance. Just candlelight, their hands touching across the table, and the sound of their children fluttering in Selene's belly like a secret rhythm only they could hear. Later that night, as they folded laundry together, Kyle paused. "You were never the storm," he said. "You were the reason I walked through it." She reached for his hand. "I didn't walk behind you," she said. "I walked with you." And that's when Kyle understood something he'd never learned in business school. Love doesn't rescue you. It reminds you who you are, and stays when the world starts asking hard questions. Have you ever had to stand strong beside someone you love when the world judged you? Drop a heart in the comments. The community center was always buzzing by noon. Children spilled out of classrooms, hands stained with color, shoes untied, voices full of energy. Selene stood in the middle of it all, aprons smudged with blue and yellow, guiding. A boy with wide eyes on how to blend two shades without turning everything brown. "Gentle strokes," she said, placing her hand over his. "Let the colors talk to each other." Kyle watched from the hallway, arms crossed, a quiet smile tugging at his lips. He wasn't there for appearances anymore. He wasn't funding the center. He was just there, because it had become part of his life, the way coffee in the morning and laughter in the kitchen had. Selene's voice floated through the space, warm, patient, present. She belonged here, not as a symbol or headline, but as someone who understood the importance of expression, especially for children who had too few ways to speak. One of the girls ran up to Kyle and held out her palm, revealing a crumpled paper flower. "For the baby," she whispered. Kyle knelt, smiling as he accepted it. "Thank you," he said softly. "She's going to love it." The girl grinned and ran back to her table. Back inside, Selene glanced at him and gave a knowing look. This was her world. And now, it was his too. Not because he controlled it, but because he chose to show up. On most mornings now, Kyle woke before the sun, not to read earnings reports or return investor calls, but to make breakfast, open windows, and walk through the garden barefoot. Their home was modest compared to the skyscraper he once called his fortress, but it had a backyard, a small vegetable patch, a rocking chair that creaked when the wind passed. And it had laughter, constant, easy laughter. He liked watching Selene teach the twins new words, even if those words were occasionally made up. He liked that their days didn't revolve around calendars, but around naps, snacks, and messy discoveries. Elio was loud and curious, always reaching for things he couldn't quite hold yet. Mireille, named after the woman who once taught Kyle to open his heart, was quieter, watchful, content to study the world before deciding what to do with it. Some days Kyle would sit on the porch and just watch them, Selene brushing, Mireille's hair, Elio clapping to a beat only he could hear. He never imagined this life, not in his best forecasts, not in his daydreams. But now that he had it, he couldn't imagine anything more complete. He held her in his arms, barely larger than a loaf of bread. Her fingers curled instinctively around his thumb, her breathing shallow and steady. Selene was resting, tired but smiling, her hand never leaving the side of the bassinet. The delivery had been long, the hospital, bright and unfamiliar. But the moment they heard two strong cries fill the room, Kyle had felt something shift. A door opened inside him, one he didn't know still existed. He looked down at his daughter again. "Mireille," he whispered, the name rolling off his tongue like a benediction. Selene stirred. "You sure?" He nodded. "I want her to know, not just that she's loved, but that love can come twice. That memory isn't something we run from. It's something we honor." They didn't speak for a while. The silence wasn't heavy. It was full. Later, when they returned home, Kyle stood in the nursery, the one with stars in the corners, and sunlight painted behind the door, and rocked Mireille in his arms until she slept. He whispered to her about a woman who played violin in the mornings, about how she once made pancakes that were always slightly burnt, about how she taught him that gentleness is strength. And then he whispered something else, something that wasn't for the past, I'll protect you, and I'll be present. That's my promise." He placed her gently in the crib beside her brother, heart full. Years passed, not rushed, not wasted. Kyle didn't return to the boardroom. He still consulted occasionally, choosing projects that aligned with his new values. But he no longer measured his days in outcomes. He measured them in tiny hands tugging his sleeves, in crayon portraits taped to the fridge, in quiet dinners with Selene, where the only background noise was wine through open windows. On the anniversary of Mireille's passing, Kyle didn't disappear. Instead, he took his daughter and son to the park. Selene packed a picnic. They sat near the water, the same place he once told Selene his story, the place where healing had begun. He didn't cry that day, but he did close his eyes, hand resting gently on the grass. "Thank you," he said again, "for the first love, for the courage to find the second." That night, he tucked both children into bed and kissed their foreheads. Selene was standing by the window when he returned, looking out over their quiet property. He wrapped his arms around her from behind. "You think they'll be okay?" he asked softly. "They already are," she said. He kissed her neck. "You gave me something I didn't think I'd find again." She turned, resting her head against his chest. "Not something," she whispered. "Someone." They stood in silence for a long time, watching the moon rise, their hands linked. Kyle once believed that love, once lost, never returned. But now he knew the truth. Some love stays in your story forever, and some love arrives when you're finally ready to live it. There's a certain stillness that follows storms, not silence, but the kind of quiet, where breath comes easier, where light filters through places once closed. Kyle had lived much of his life in shadow, not because he was weak, but because he didn't know that healing wasn't forgetting. He thought moving on meant leaving love behind, but he was wrong. The truth was gentler, more human. Love doesn't vanish. It waits. It waits for the heart to soften, for the hands to open again, for the walls to lower. Selene didn't rescue him. She didn't fill a void left by someone else. She met him in his truth, saw the cracks, and sat with him anyway. Not to patch him up, but to walk with him as he learned how to live again. Their life wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was honest, shared, built with both laughter and grief. And that made it real. Kyle believed, for years, that one moment had defined him forever. One mistake, one loss, one crash. He built a fortress around it, decorated it with wealth, guarded it with silence. But grief doesn't have to be a life sentence. You are not what happened to you. You are not the version of yourself that crumbled in that moment of pain. You are the person who survived it, the one who kept showing up, the one who dared to feel again, even when it hurt. Even if you've been at your lowest, that isn't where your story has to end. Kyle was known for being composed, controlled, precise. But what made him truly strong wasn't his business acumen or his bank account. It was the night he finally told Selene the full story. The moment he stood at Mireille's grave, not to beg for peace, but to say thank you. Strength wasn't in what he held back. It was in what he let himself feel. It takes courage to speak what's never been said, to admit what you've carried, to show someone where it hurts and trust they won't run. That's not weakness. That's the beginning of something unbreakable. Kyle didn't move on from Mireille. He didn't bury her memory to make space for Selene. Instead, he let love evolve. He allowed his heart to expand, not to replace, but to honor what came before and still open the door for what came next. Love isn't a ledger. It doesn't subtract. It grows. It shifts, shapes. It teaches. It reminds us that people who are no longer with us still echo through the lives we build after them. And in naming his daughter Mireille, Kyle wasn't clinging to the past. He was carrying it forward with tenderness, not pain. Kyle could have stayed in the tower. He could have continued living in a world built on numbers, where no one asked real questions and silence was mistaken for strength. But he chose differently. He chose to face the very thing he feared most, beginning again. Courage didn't come all at once. It arrived slowly, in a coffee shop conversation, in a walk through a park, in a whispered confession at night, in the nursery, with its clouds on the ceiling and soft sun behind the door. Healing doesn't announce itself. It waits for you to open the door. Selene never promised Kyle an easy life. She didn't ask him to be cheerful every day or pretend he wasn't carrying something heavy. She simply showed up. When the media turned cruel, she didn't run. When the board turned on him, she stood still. When the world asked too much, she reminded him that peace was a choice they could make, together. True love isn't just about joyful days and celebrations. It's about standing shoulder to shoulder in the hard parts, being the steady voice when doubt creeps in, being the stillness when the world turns loud. It's about choosing each other over and over again, even when it's not easy, especially when it's not easy. Kyl's story is not just about love. It's about what happens after the loss. It's about the moments when we believe the best of life is already behind us, and the quiet miracles that prove us wrong. It's about second chances that don't announce themselves. They arrive softly, in people who listen without fixing, in children who laugh without history, in mornings that feel light again. It's about the kind of life that's not measured in success, but in the peace that follows you home. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more emotional journeys and comment below. What does forgiveness mean to you?